Hello. So in today's lesson, we are looking at crime in a period known as the later Middle Ages. And that's roughly the time period of 1150 to 1500. Again, we've been investigating that first of our four time periods, the year 1000 to 1500, and this is the last investigation into this section. We've got two learning objectives: to understand how law enforcement changed in the later Middle Ages, and to understand why this period saw new laws and punishments being introduced in Britain. Now, in your Google Classroom, you have got two quizzes to complete. Now, I will prompt you when to complete each quiz, but please take your time, read each question carefully, make sure you load up the correct quiz. You only get one attempt. Now, any questions you've got, feel free to contact your teacher, or you can contact me, gbrown@stopsleyhighschool.co.uk. So, first of all, let's look at law enforcement. And Henry II became king in 1154, and he made some very important changes to crime and punishment across the country. Now, basically, Henry wanted the king to have more control over the law in England. He was starting to see different communities enact the law in different ways. So how did he deal with this? Well, first of all, he came up with something in 1166 called the Assize of Clarendon. Now, what this meant was royal judges, so people that Henry had picked himself, they were known as justices in Eyre, and Henry sent them all off across the country. They would visit each county twice a year, and their job was to hear the most serious court cases. Now, this meant the king had an increased role in legal matters. Now, this created a slight problem, because where do you hold these people until the justices in Eyre turn up, because they might not arrive for weeks? And so what we see is prisons being set up to keep criminals in until their case could be heard. You didn't really have prisons back then until this point, because usually you just either killed the person, made them pay a fine, or mutilated them with corporal punishment. Now we are seeing people being held in prisons more often. Also, Henry wanted to make sure everyone was doing the same thing. And so standard written instructions, like a book of law, were given to the Shire Reeve. Now, this was the person in charge of enforcing the law in every county in England. This made sure that everyone followed the same rules. They were told exactly what to do for each situation. There were no excuses at all. And that term Shire Reeve eventually becomes known as sheriff, which is more common in our language today. Now, after Henry died, his son Richard took the throne. Now, he might not have liked his father, but he carried on his work with law enforcement. Now, when Richard became King Richard in 1194, one of his first actions was introducing coroners to deal with situations where there was a suspicious death or no natural explanation like an illness. Now, what a coroner does is essentially check a body to see how the person died and write a report on that. It's still a system we've got today, as this more modern picture in the bottom of the screen shows. And we still have some of the coroner reports from the later Middle Ages. Here's just an example of two of them. So we've got Simon the Welshman, the clerk, died 1306, struck with a knife on the head by the vicar for being late to church to ring the bells for matins. And William Scribe died 1382, fell from a tree attempting to overthrow a nest of magpies. They are genuine reports from the time. Now, in 1195, Richard appointed keepers of the king's peace. Now, these were knights that were sent to areas which were seen as a bit unruly. It was difficult to keep law and order in these areas. So Richard said, basically, I'm sending some backup. Here are some knights to make sure that there are no issues. Now, this worked so well that in 1327, a new king, Edward III, extended this system to just all areas of England. So the king had more of a presence. He had his knights there, keepers of the king's peace. How did you get this role? Well, if you were judged to be good and lawful, and of course more importantly rich, then you had a chance of getting this role and enforcing the law for the king. In 1361, we see a name change. They're now being called Justices of the Peace, or JPs. And Edward also created the role of night watchmen for towns. So what did being a night watchman involve? Well, it was your job to walk around the town at night, armed with a lantern, armed with a stick, and you were just checking for any suspicious activity. You were patrolling the area. And if you saw something dodgy happening, you would raise the hue and cry, and you'd report back to the parish constable in the morning about what you had seen. So it could be written down, it could be made a note of. Now, this was dangerous, it was unpaid work, and as you can imagine, people didn't really want to do it. It was the job of every male citizen of the town to take part at some point. So you didn't have a say, it was done on a rotational basis. So what was the issue with towns? Well, towns were becoming more populated at this time. By the year 1200, London had an estimated population of 30,000. So to help keep the law in towns, the towns were divided into smaller sections, and these were called wards. So this picture just shows how you could divide the city of London up today into wards. So it's a similar sort of thing. Now, this is just like the tithing system in the countryside. So you're basically saying that this area, this huge town, isn't enough for one person to patrol. So you split it into sections, and then each person works on a different section to make sure that law and order can be kept. It's a bit like break time duty, I suppose, at school. So you can't just have one person patrolling the entire school to make sure there's no fights, etc. So you give different teachers different parts to patrol of the school. Now, people were expected to help catch criminals still, using the hue and cry method. And again, if you saw a crime taking place, you would shout for help, you would chase the suspect yourself. So there's still some parts of the community getting involved. However, as we've seen, the king was appointing people now to keep the law, with things like the justices of the peace, Justices Anaya. And he's not just leaving up to the communities. The king is now deciding who should be in charge of the law in areas as well. We've got another change here with tithing men. Now, the leader of the tithing, if you remember, this was a group of 10 men in the countryside. This person became known as a constable rather than the tithing man. So, to sum up with law enforcement, what do we see changing during this time period? Well, the king clearly was showing more power over law enforcement. He was deciding who should enforce the law at this time. He was creating new positions like the Justices of the Peace, or the JPs. Now, people chosen by the king, like we said, were selected because of their status and wealth. There were more positions, such as the night watchman, and they were needed because of the population growing in areas like the towns. The king was now deciding the rules for the entire country and ensuring that they were followed with written instructions. Now, this removed the power of the community who used to make up different laws for different areas. But there's still continuity here, because the community was still expected to help with some parts of law enforcement, such as the hue and cry and roles like the night watchman. So whilst there is a huge amount of change with law enforcement, there are some bits that still stay the same. Okay, so task 1 then. Please complete quiz 1. To make it easy for you in Google Classroom, it is the quiz out of the 2 that is called Quiz 1, Law Enforcement in the Later Middle Ages. If you need to go back, the red slides will help. Please pause the video, read the questions carefully, complete the quiz, and then press play to continue. Okay, so let's talk now about laws and punishments. Firstly, the laws. Well, we see Parliament create 2 new crimes, which leads to new laws in the later Middle Ages. Now, the first one is called the Statute of Labourers. Now, after the Black Death hit England in 1348, a third of the population died of the plague. Now, as a result, there were far fewer workers to do jobs like working the lands, sowing crops, harvesting for the rich people. And so the peasants started demanding more money for their work. They wanted more rights, they wanted more money. Else they would move to work for someone else who could afford their wages. Now, before the Black Death, if you were a peasant and you tried this, they would just say, no, you can clear off, and I've got plenty of other people around who will do the work. But now that decrease in population has meant there are far fewer peasants around. And so if you don't pay the higher wage demands, the peasant might well say, well, I'm going to move and I'm going to work for someone who will pay for my work. As you can imagine, the ruling classes were terrified about this. They wanted to keep the peasants poor. They didn't want to pay more money to these people. They didn't want the peasants to start to become more powerful. And so the rich, which included the members of parliament, created a new law to stop this nonsense and to protect their own interests. That law was the Statute of Labourers. It was passed by Parliament in 1351. And by the way, when we say Parliament, please don't start to think this is like our Parliament system today, where it's someone from each different area and it can be from any background. These are only a few very rich men who have got a lot of land in England. So it's different from our Parliament today, but it's the start of it. Now, the Parliament said, we are creating a maximum wage for workers. So whereas today we've got a minimum wage, this was a maximum wage. They could not be paid any more than this. It was made illegal to ask for more money, and it was made illegal to move to a new area to look for better paid work. If you did either of those two things, you could be severely punished if you were a peasant. So, this law is an example of change and continuity from the Norman period we looked at before, that period of 1066 to 1150. So why is it a change? Well, under the Normans, the laws were made by the king alone. But now we are starting to see Parliament being introduced. Parliament starting to have a say in lawmaking. And this is an example. This law was passed by Parliament and not just by the king, as it would have been during the Norman period. But it's also an example of continuity as well, because what we're seeing is in the Norman period, the rulers introduced new laws to protect their interests. For example, William created the forest laws to protect what he saw as his woodland for hunting. Here, we've got the wealthy members of Parliament saying, we want to stay rich, we don't want to give the peasants more money, and so this law was created to protect them. So both times, Normans and the later Middle Ages, we are seeing the rich creating new laws to protect their own interests at the expense of the peasants. So the Statute of Labourers is an example of change and also continuity as well. The second crime is that of heresy. So from the 1400s, there was a small number of people who started to question the church and its teachings. And they started to feel that the church should change, it should reform. And some examples of changes included the Bible. They said, well, hang on a minute, the Bible shouldn't be in Latin. The Bible should be in English. We should all be able to read the Bible. It shouldn't just be locked up away in the church. Now, both the church and the king saw this growing group of people as a threat. And so, new laws were brought in to stop this in 1382, 1401, and 1414. And a new crime was developed. This crime was heresy. And heresy is basically going against the religion of your country. So those people who were starting to question the Christian faith and how it was being delivered in churches were seen as criminals. Now, if you were convicted of heresy, you were known as a heretic. And if you were found guilty from 1401, one of those law changes we've seen there, you were burnt at the stake. This would be a public execution where people would see what happened if you turned into a heretic, a very powerful deterrent. And it was basically symbolizing this idea of we are purifying you. You're a corrupt soul. If you die now, you will go to hell. But by burning you alive, we are burning the sin from you. We are making you a more pure person. And there's a possibility you will go to heaven instead. But as you can imagine, like we said, this was a huge deterrent for people as well, being forced out to watch someone being burnt alive. Finally, let's look at the punishments. Well, you still see a mixture of fines being paid, corporal punishment such as mutilation, and execution like hanging during this time period. So we've got a lot of continuity from what we've seen in the past. But a new punishment was introduced for the most serious crime of all, and this crime was known as high treason. This was when you plotted to kill the king or betray him. So it's a very specific crime, trying to remove the leader of your country. This was seen as a crime against the king obviously, but also against God as well. And the idea was that God had chosen who should be leader. God had decided, and if you were trying to remove the leader, you were therefore going against God's wishes. Now, the punishment used was called hung, drawn, and quartered. And this is how it would work. So you would be hung in public again, so everyone's watching in your area, until you were nearly killed. Your body was basically spasming, your face had turned blue, but before you could die, you were cut down. And then that's the hung part, then the drawn part. A line would be drawn down across your chest, and whilst you were still alive, you would feel the executioner move their hands inside of you and pull out your intestines and cut your privates off. And then after you had died, because that can be lethal, after you had died, your limbs would then be cut off and sent to different parts of the country to be displayed as a warning. So you might end up with someone's leg, for example, in your town as a warning of what will happen if you go against the king. As you can imagine, this would act as a huge deterrent about people who were thinking about challenging the king's power at this time. It's a bit gross, that one. I probably should have warned you first of all, but it doesn't matter, it's okay. Anyway, task 2. Please now complete quiz 2. This should be the second quiz in Google Classrooms, the one you've not touched yet. It's called Quiz 2, New Laws and Punishments in the Later Middle Ages. Again, please read it carefully before you complete it. Pause the video here, the green slides will help if you need it, and then press play to conclude this lesson. And that's it. By now you should have completed both quizzes. Thank you very much, as always, for taking part in today's lesson. I'm hoping it was useful. Any questions or queries you've got, as usual, contact me, gbrown@stopseyhighschool.co.uk. And please look after yourselves, get some fresh air and exercise, and I will see you soon. Take care and all the best. Bye-bye.